The person you keep abandoning is you, not all at once, not in one dramatic collapse, not in some obvious, unforgettable moment where everything falls apart in public. It happens quietly, gradually, in ways so familiar that most people mistake them for maturity, kindness, or love. You say yes when your whole body wants to say no. You laugh at something that hurt you because you do not want to make things awkward. You stay available to people who only reach for you when they need something. You shrink your truth so other people can stay comfortable. And each time you do it, a small part of you steps back. A small part of you learns that your feelings can wait, your needs can wait, your standards can wait. Eventually, the person who keeps getting pushed to the end of the line is you. That is why so many people feel disconnected from themselves without knowing exactly why. They are not lazy. They are not broken. They are not incapable of confidence or self-respect. They have simply spent too long practicing self-abandonment in small, socially acceptable ways. They have learned how to be easy to deal with, agreeable, available, useful, low maintenance, endlessly understanding, and the world often rewards that at first. People call you sweet, easygoing, selfless, but beneath that praise something more dangerous is happening. You are being trained to value harmony over honesty, approval over self-trust, belonging over dignity. The Stoics would have recognized this immediately. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we care too much about what other people think and too little about the judgment we hold of ourselves. That is the trap. We say we want peace, but we keep trading pieces of ourselves to buy it from other people. We say we want love, but we keep offering ourselves in distorted forms so we will be easier to accept. We say we want confidence, but we keep living in ways that quietly tell the mind, my truth is less important than their comfort. And this is where the real damage begins. Not because other people fail to see your worth, but because you slowly stop living as if you believe in it yourself. Self-love does not disappear in one day. It erodes through repetition, through every moment you ignore your own inner signal, through every compromise that teaches your nervous system staying connected to others matters more than staying connected to myself. So, this is the first truth. Before you can love yourself more deeply, you have to notice where you keep leaving yourself behind. Because the path back to self-respect does not begin with affirmations, it begins with recognition. Before you can rebuild your relationship with yourself, you have to understand how it was damaged in the first place. Most people assume self-love disappears because of one major failure, heartbreak, or rejection. But the truth is far quieter than that. The loss of self-respect usually happens through small daily habits that slowly train your mind to value everyone else more than you value yourself. Think about how most people move through their day. From the moment they wake up, their attention is pulled outward. Notifications, messages, expectations, responsibilities, conversations where they try to say the right thing, act the right way, and avoid making anyone uncomfortable. By the end of the day, they have spent hours responding to other people's needs while barely asking themselves a simple question: what do I actually feel? What do I actually want? Over time, that pattern becomes automatic. You begin measuring your worth by how useful you are, how agreeable you are, how easy you are to deal with. If people approve of you, you feel valuable. If someone criticizes you or withdraws their attention, your confidence collapses. Your emotional stability becomes tied to forces outside your control. The Stoics warned about this long before modern psychology ever studied it. Epictetus taught that the moment you place your peace in the hands of others, you surrender your freedom. If your sense of worth depends on praise, acceptance, or recognition, then your emotional life becomes a hostage to other people's opinions. This is why so many people feel exhausted without understanding why. They are constantly managing impressions. They are adjusting their personality depending on the room they are in. They say what they think people want to hear. They hide parts of themselves that might cause friction. They sacrifice honesty for harmony again and again until something inside them begins to feel numb. At first, this behavior can look like kindness or maturity, but there is a crucial difference between compassion and self-neglect. Compassion means caring about others without abandoning yourself. Self-neglect means slowly erasing your own voice in order to keep the peace. Marcus Aurelius understood this tension deeply. Despite ruling the largest empire in the world, he constantly reminded himself that his duty was not to satisfy every opinion around him. His duty was to live in alignment with his own principles. That alignment created inner stability. Without it, no amount of approval could create real peace. So the second truth is simple but uncomfortable. Self-love cannot exist where self-betrayal is a daily habit. If you constantly silence your own needs, ignore your intuition, and reshape yourself to fit other people's expectations, your mind will eventually believe that your truth does not matter. And once the mind learns that lesson, it becomes very difficult to feel worthy of love from anyone, including yourself. One of the clearest signs that you have drifted away from yourself is the constant need to please everyone around you. On the surface, people-pleasing looks like kindness. It looks like generosity, cooperation, and emotional intelligence. But underneath that polite surface, there is often something much deeper at work: fear. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being misunderstood, or fear of losing someone's approval. And when fear becomes the reason behind your decisions, your life slowly stops belonging to you. Many people never realize how exhausting this pattern becomes because it develops gradually. At first, it seems harmless to say yes when someone asks for help. Then, it becomes easier to agree, even when you are already overwhelmed. Eventually, you start anticipating what others want before they even ask. You shape your words carefully so no one feels uncomfortable. You hide opinions that might create disagreement. You smile through situations that quietly drain your energy. And over time, the person you have trained yourself to protect the least is the one person you are responsible for protecting yourself. The Stoics had a very direct understanding of this problem. Epictetus taught that if you want to improve your life, you must be willing to appear foolish or strange in the eyes of others. That statement is not about rebellion or arrogance. It is about independence. The moment you stop organizing your entire behavior around other people's reactions, you begin reclaiming authority over your own mind. People who constantly try to satisfy everyone else often believe they are maintaining harmony. In reality, they are sacrificing authenticity. Real harmony cannot exist where truth is constantly suppressed. When you repeatedly ignore your own boundaries just to keep things comfortable, resentment slowly begins to build beneath the surface. You may still appear calm and agreeable on the outside, but internally you start feeling invisible, misunderstood, or emotionally drained. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself often that other people's opinions belong to them, not to you. You are responsible for your actions, your principles, and your character, but you are not responsible for controlling how everyone interprets them. That distinction is what allows a person to act with integrity rather than fear. Choosing yourself does not mean becoming cold or selfish. It means learning the difference between generosity and self-erasure. You can still help others, support friends, and show compassion without abandoning your own needs and values in the process. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, not quiet self-sacrifice from one side. When you begin practicing this shift, it may feel uncomfortable at first. Saying no when you would normally say yes can create tension. Expressing an honest opinion might surprise people who are used to your constant agreement. But discomfort is not always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes it is a sign that something honest is finally being expressed. The more you choose honesty over approval, the more your mind begins to trust you again. And when that trust returns, something powerful starts to grow in its place: self-respect. Once you begin reclaiming your voice and setting boundaries with the outside world, another battle quietly reveals itself, one that takes place entirely inside your own mind. Even after you stop abandoning yourself for others, there may still be a voice within you that continues the same pattern of criticism and rejection. It is the inner voice that whispers, "You are not good enough, not disciplined enough, not successful enough." And the strange thing is that many people listen to this voice every day without ever questioning where it came from. Imagine for a moment how you would speak to someone you deeply care about. If a close friend made a mistake, struggled with confidence, or felt lost about their future, you would probably respond with patience and encouragement. You would remind them of their strengths. You would tell them that mistakes are part of growth and that their worth is not defined by a single failure. Yet, when the same situation happens to you, the tone changes immediately. Instead of compassion, you offer yourself judgment. Instead of patience, you respond with frustration. Instead of encouragement, you replay your mistakes until they feel heavier than they really are. The Stoics understood that the mind becomes the environment in which we live. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul takes on the color of its thoughts. This means that the way you speak to yourself does not remain neutral. Your thoughts shape your identity. If your inner dialogue is constantly harsh, critical, and unforgiving, your mind slowly begins to believe that you are someone who deserves that treatment. Many people assume that being hard on themselves is a form of discipline. They believe harsh self-criticism will push them to improve. But in reality, constant internal punishment rarely creates growth. More often it creates hesitation, fear of failure, and emotional exhaustion. When the mind becomes a place of constant attack, it stops being a place where confidence and creativity can grow. Learning to speak to yourself with respect is not weakness, it is clarity. It means recognizing that improvement does not come from self-hatred, but from honest awareness combined with patience. The Stoics never suggested ignoring mistakes or pretending everything is fine. Instead, they practiced observing themselves calmly, correcting what was necessary, and continuing forward without unnecessary self-condemnation. When you catch your mind turning against you, pause for a moment and ask a simple question. Would I speak this way to someone I love? If the answer is no, then that voice is not wisdom. It is simply a habit that can be changed. Replace it with something more honest and more constructive. Instead of saying, I always fail, remind yourself, I am still learning. Instead of thinking I am not capable, shift to, I haven't mastered this yet. Over time, this small shift begins to rebuild trust between you and yourself. Your mind becomes less like a battlefield and more like a place where growth is possible. And when that happens, something subtle but powerful changes in your life. You stop looking for constant reassurance from the outside world because you are no longer at war with the person you are inside. Another powerful step in learning to love yourself is something many people avoid entirely: learning how to be alone without feeling empty. In a world filled with constant noise, endless notifications, and the pressure to always be connected, solitude can feel uncomfortable. Many people rush to fill every quiet moment with distractions, music playing in the background, social media, scrolling conversations that never allow the mind to rest. But beneath all that noise often lies a quiet fear, the fear of facing ourselves without distractions. The Stoics believed that solitude was not something to escape, but something to practice. Seneca once wrote that a person who cannot spend time alone with themselves has not yet learned the art of living freely. When you depend entirely on others for entertainment, comfort, or validation, your emotional stability becomes fragile. You begin to feel restless when no one is around, uneasy when silence appears, and anxious when you are not receiving attention or reassurance. This is not because something is wrong with you. It is because most people are never taught how to develop a peaceful relationship with their own mind. From an early age, we are trained to constantly seek stimulation and approval from the outside world. Over time, we become strangers to ourselves. We know how to interact with others, but we do not know how to sit quietly with our own thoughts. Yet something remarkable happens when you begin to spend intentional time alone. At first, it may feel awkward. Your mind may race with unfinished worries, memories, or doubts that were previously buried under distractions. But if you stay with that silence long enough, it begins to transform. You start noticing your thoughts with more clarity. You begin to understand your own desires, fears, and motivations in ways that are impossible when your attention is constantly scattered. Marcus Aurelius practiced this kind of solitude regularly. Even while ruling an empire surrounded by political chaos, He created moments of reflection where he could step back and observe his own mind. These quiet moments allowed him to reconnect with his values and realign his actions with the person he wanted to be. Solitude also changes the way you approach relationships. When you learn to enjoy your own company, you stop chasing people simply to avoid loneliness. You begin choosing relationships based on genuine connection rather than emotional dependency. Instead of clinging to others for validation, you interact with them from a place of stability and self-respect. This shift creates a quiet confidence that others can feel. You no longer need constant attention to feel secure. You are comfortable in your own presence, and that comfort becomes a source of strength. Loving your own company does not mean isolating yourself from the world. It means developing a relationship with yourself that is strong enough to stand on its own. When you can sit in silence without feeling incomplete, you discover something many people spend their lives searching for: a sense of peace that does not depend on anyone else being there. Once you become comfortable with your own company, something important begins to shift inside you. The silence that once felt uncomfortable starts to reveal something deeper: your true desires. Without the constant noise of other people's expectations, you finally begin to hear a quieter question rising from within you. What do I actually want to do with my life? For many people, this question is surprisingly difficult to answer, not because they lack ambition, but because their goals have been shaped for years by outside influence. Society tells you what success should look like. Family members project their expectations onto your future. Social media presents endless examples of lives that appear impressive from the outside. Slowly, without realizing it, you begin chasing things that were never truly yours to begin with. The Stoics warned about this kind of borrowed ambition. Epictetus believed that before you act, you must first decide the kind of person you want to become. Only after defining that identity should your actions follow. Without that clarity, it is easy to spend years pursuing achievements that leave you feeling strangely empty once you reach them. Real self-love means having the courage to pursue goals that genuinely matter to you, even if they do not look impressive to everyone else. When your goals come from a place of authenticity rather than comparison or pressure, your relationship with effort changes completely. Work stops feeling like a burden you must endure, and instead becomes a process of building something meaningful for yourself. This does not mean every moment will feel exciting or easy. Discipline is still required. The Stoics never romanticized effort. They believed that meaningful progress comes from consistent action, even when motivation fades. But when the direction is truly yours, that discipline feels different. Instead of pushing yourself out of fear or obligation, you move forward because the path itself feels worth walking. Marcus Aurelius lived this idea in a powerful way. Despite the enormous pressure of ruling an empire, he constantly reminded himself to focus on what was within his control: his character, his actions, and his commitment to doing meaningful work. His goal was not fame or approval, but the quiet satisfaction of living according to his principles. When you begin chasing goals that genuinely ignite your curiosity and passion, something powerful happens to your sense of self-worth. You stop measuring your value by how others respond to you. Your progress becomes the evidence that you are capable of growth. Each step forward, no matter how small, strengthens your belief in yourself. This is why purpose and self-love are closely connected. When you invest your energy in building something that reflects your values, you send a powerful message to your own mind. My life matters enough to build something meaningful with it. And that message, repeated through consistent effort, slowly transforms the way you see yourself. Instead of waiting for the world to tell you that you are valuable, you begin proving it to yourself through the way you live. As you begin pursuing goals that genuinely matter to you, another important shift must take place if self-love is going to grow into something stable and lasting. You must learn how to recognize your own progress. Many people work incredibly hard, push themselves constantly, and strive to improve every day. Yet they still feel as if they are never doing enough. No matter how far they have come, Their attention immediately jumps to the next goal, the next problem, or the next mistake. This habit slowly creates a dangerous mindset, the belief that your value only exists somewhere in the future. You tell yourself that you will finally feel proud once you achieve a certain milestone, reach a certain level of success, or become the version of yourself you imagine in your mind. Until then, you remain stuck in a constant state of self-criticism. The Stoics understood that this mentality quietly robs people of peace. Seneca warned that many individuals spend their entire lives chasing the next achievement, while forgetting to appreciate the progress they have already made. They live as if their current moment is always insufficient, always incomplete. Real self-love requires a different perspective. It requires learning how to acknowledge your efforts, not just your outcomes. Every time you choose discipline over comfort, you are strengthening your character. Every time you respond to difficulty with patience instead of frustration, you are growing in wisdom. Every time you continue moving forward despite uncertainty, you are proving your resilience. Marcus Aurelius practiced this kind of reflection daily. Through his personal writings, he examined his actions, not to punish himself but to understand his own development. By observing both his strengths and weaknesses with honesty, he created space for improvement without losing respect for himself in the process. When you begin celebrating your progress, even in small ways, you train your mind to recognize growth rather than constantly searching for flaws. This does not mean ignoring your mistakes or pretending everything is perfect. It means giving equal attention to the effort you are making and the distance you have already traveled. Consider how different your mindset becomes when you pause and acknowledge your own journey, the struggles you have survived, the lessons you have learned, the discipline you have built, and the courage it took simply to keep going when things were uncertain. These are not small accomplishments. They are evidence that you are evolving. When you learn to recognize these moments, you no longer depend entirely on praise from the outside world. Your sense of pride begins to come from within. You become your own witness, someone who sees the quiet victories that others may never notice. Over time, this practice creates a powerful emotional stability. Instead of constantly feeling behind or inadequate, you begin to see your life as an unfolding process of growth. Each day becomes an opportunity to improve, but also an opportunity to appreciate the person you are becoming along the way. When you begin to practice all of these ideas together, setting boundaries, changing the way you speak to yourself, becoming comfortable in solitude, pursuing meaningful goals, and recognizing your own growth, you start to notice a quiet but powerful transformation. It does not happen overnight. There is no dramatic moment where everything suddenly becomes perfect. Instead, the change unfolds gradually, almost silently, as your relationship with yourself becomes stronger and more stable. At first, the difference appears in small moments. You stop overthinking every opinion someone has about you. A criticism that once would have ruined your entire day now becomes something you can examine calmly. You begin making decisions based on what aligns with your values rather than what will gain approval. You no longer feel the same urgency to prove your worth to the world because you are beginning to feel it within yourself. This is what the Stoics meant when they spoke about inner stability. They were not promising a life free of difficulty or disappointment. In fact, they expected challenges to be part of every human life. What they believed was that a person who understands themselves and respects their own values becomes far less shaken by those difficulties. Their peace no longer depends on circumstances constantly going their way. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the most important work a person can do is the work they do within their own mind. Everything else in life, success, recognition, status, even relationships, can change without warning. But the character you build within yourself becomes the one thing that travels with you through every experience. When you begin loving yourself in the way the Stoics describe, you stop chasing validation from every direction. You no longer feel the need to be understood by everyone you meet. Some people will appreciate your boundaries, your honesty, and your independence. Others may not. But that difference no longer determines how you see yourself. Instead, you develop a quieter kind of confidence. You trust your decisions more. You treat your body and mind with greater respect. You allow yourself space to grow, make mistakes, and learn without immediately turning against yourself. The relationship you once searched for in others begins to exist within your own mind, and that is the deeper meaning of self-love. It is not about believing you are perfect. It is not about ignoring your flaws or convincing yourself that life will always be easy. It is about creating a foundation of respect and understanding inside yourself so that no matter what happens around you, you remain connected to who you are. When that connection becomes strong, something remarkable happens. The world around you may still be chaotic, unpredictable, and sometimes unfair, but you no longer feel lost inside it. You carry a sense of stability with you because the most important relationship in your life, the one you have with yourself, has finally become a source of strength rather than doubt.